What if the words politicians use aren't just, selling a policy, but actually reprogramming how we view human life?
Oh, that is a huge question to start with.
Right. Because usually when we think about political language, we treat it a bit like packaging. You listen to a speech, you mentally rip off the wrapping paper of the rhetoric, and you look inside to see the actual policy.
Yeah, like the tax cut or the border policy or the healthcare plan.
Exactly. We assume the words are merely there to sell the product. But today, we are exploring a totally different premise.
We're looking at what happens when language is the actual building block of our reality.
Welcome to the deep dive. If you're someone who wants to understand the hidden frameworks behind the daily news cycle, you are in exactly the right place.
We are unpacking a really comprehensive, scholarly German analysis today.
Yeah, and it sets up a massive rhetorical collision. We're looking at the fiercely populist, identity-driven language of U.S. Senator JD Vance put directly up against the ancient, unyielding social ethics of Pope Francis.
And honestly, looking at a conservative populist politician and the head of the global Catholic Church in the same breath is just a fascinating exercise in structural comparison.
It really is.
The research we are digging into today lines up official statements, legislative actions, and verified quotes from Vance right alongside official Vatican documents.
Right, to see how these two vastly different figures use language to construct their vision of society.
Exactly.
Now, looking at a conservative populist and the Catholic Pope in the same breath is stepping on a lot of political landmines.
No, absolutely.
So, to be absolutely clear to you listening, our job today isn't to play referee. We're not here to endorse Vance's politics or the Pope's theology.
No, we aren't here to pass moral judgment at all.
Right. Our goal is to use this scholarly research to look under the hood of their language, to see how their respective words build totally different realities.
Because whether you realize it or not, the media you consume every day uses language to do one of two things.
It either builds bridges or it creates threat narratives. And we are going to decode the mechanics of that language today.
To really understand this collision, though, we have to throw out our standard political compass.
Yeah, this is definitely not a simple left versus right, progressive versus conservative matchup.
Not at all. Framing Pope Francis as some sort of secular progressive foil to J.D. Vance's conservatism is historically inaccurate.
And it misses the core of his theology, right?
Completely. Francis operates from a very specific Catholic social ethic. And the absolute bedrock starting point for that ethic is the unassailable human dignity of every single person.
Let's unpack that word for a second, unassailable. Because in an everyday political context, we often talk about citizens earning their keep.
Right, contributing to society, paying taxes.
Yeah, but unassailable means this dignity isn't a wage you earn. It's not conditional on your nationality, your productivity, or, well, your family status, or even your moral perfection.
It's an inherent trait that cannot be revoked.
Yeah.
It is entirely pre-existing.
Okay, so that's the baseline.
Right. This scholarly breakdown uses that baseline of universal unearned dignity to evaluate the modern populist rhetoric we see today.
Specifically Vance's language.
Yes, which relies heavily on identity politics, in-groups and out-groups.
It's like looking at two architects who might even use some of the same conservative bricks, like a focus on traditional family values or the protection of life.
Good analogy.
But because they are working off completely different blueprints, they are building fundamentally different houses. One architect is building a fortress to protect an in-group.
And the other is building a sanctuary that supposedly has no walls.
Exactly. Still, I have to wonder if comparing a politician trying to win highly contested elections in a fractured democracy to, well, a global spiritual leader who never has to worry about poll numbers, is that a bit like comparing apples and oranges?
It's a vital distinction, which is why the methodology of this comparison is so strict.
How so?
Well, the analysis makes zero attempt to judge whether J.D. Vance, the man, is personally devout or Christian in his private life.
Because that kind of judgment is unscientific.
Exactly. Instead, it places Vance's documented words and actions in the public square on a table, places the Pope's official teachings on the social responsibility of politics right next to them, and just compares the architecture of the language.
Okay, let's move from that theoretical blueprint to the actual ground floor. The most acute, real-world example of this rhetorical clash in our stack of research centers on migration.
Yes, specifically focusing on the town of Springfield, Ohio.
Right. When you look at the documented rhetoric Vance used regarding Haitian migrants in that town, I mean, it is incredibly intense.
It really
He
is.
consistently used phrases like Haitian illegal immigrants, claimed the town was being ravaged by 20,000 migrants.
Yeah, and asserted that communicable diseases like HIV and TB had skyrocketed as a direct result.
Which is such a heavy claim.
Those specific linguistic choices do very heavy lifting. Words like ravaged and illegal combined with imagery of infectious disease, well, they do not just describe a logistical challenge.
No, they construct a narrative of invasion and contamination.
Precisely.
What strikes me here is the massive gap between the rhetoric and the reality on the ground.
Oh, absolutely.
Because when you look at the actual public health data from Ohio, or the extensive fact checks from organizations like PolitiFact and ABC News included in our research, the claims about skyrocketing HIV or TB just aren't there.
The local officials flatly denied them.
Furthermore, many of these Haitian migrants actually had legal status, temporary protected status or humanitarian parole. So why relentlessly use the word illegal when the data says otherwise?
Because it bypasses logical policy debate entirely and triggers the brain's innate disgust reflex.
Wow.
Linking marginalized groups to disease and impurity is an age-old political tactic. It shifts the public perception instantly.
So instead of looking at a crowd of people and thinking, here are human beings in a precarious situation requiring a logistical response.
The language programs the public to think these people are inherently dangerous and illegitimate. They are the root cause of our community's decay.
I have to play devil's advocate here, though. Vance famously addressed this in an interview with CNN. He essentially admitted to the strategy.
He did, yeah.
He said, if I have to create stories so that the American media actually pays attention to the suffering of the American people, then that's what I'm going to do.
Right.
So in a slightly twisted way, if a Rust Belt town is genuinely struggling with housing and infrastructure because of a sudden massive population influx, isn't he just doing his job as a representative, like getting the cameras there by any rhetorical means necessary?
That tension right there is the crux of the ethical debate. Vance's logic is that the ends bringing national attention to a local infrastructure burden justify the rhetorical means.
But Francis actually tackled this exact type of logic, didn't he?
Yes, in his 2020 writing, Fratelli Tutti, his core argument is that the moment you divorce political communication from the truth, it ceases to be leadership and becomes pure manipulation.
Because when a story relies on fear and deliberate mischaracterization to achieve a goal, it degrades the humanity of everyone involved.
Exactly. It turns those migrants into props for a political narrative.
Rather than treating them as possessors of that unassailable dignity we just talked about.
Right. Now, Francis doesn't demand naive, open-border anarchy.
No, he acknowledges a sovereign state's right to protect its citizens and manage its borders realistically.
But he centers his approach to migration around 4 highly active verbs: welcoming, protecting, promoting, and integrating.
Welcoming, protecting, promoting, and integrating.
Yes. His teaching asserts that a person's legal or economic status never diminishes their infinite worth.
So turning a vulnerable demographic into a symbol of disease and chaos directly contradicts the call to view the migrant as an opportunity to encounter humanity.
Exactly.
Okay, so that outlines how this language categorizes outsiders. But the research also shifts to examine how this rhetoric values a nation's own citizens.
Right. Looking at how people are judged based on their family status.
Which brings us to the highly publicized childless cat lady discussion. Vance commented back in 2021 that politicians without children don't really have a direct stake in the country's future.
Vance later defended those comments as sarcasm, stating he was aiming his frustration at a broader political culture that he views as structurally hostile to families and children.
Okay.
And he clarified he wasn't attacking people who couldn't have children for medical reasons.
Right. But even granting the defense of sarcasm, the scholarly analysis points out that the language itself establishes a very specific political hierarchy.
It absolutely does.
It sets up a framework where biological parenthood is essentially equated with democratic legitimacy. It's almost like treating citizenship like a corporate shareholder system.
Oh, that's a perfect way to put it.
In this rhetorical view, only the biological parents get the voting stock because they've invested actual offspring into the future. But that completely ignores the teachers, the nurses, the volunteers, the mentors, the millions of people without children who wake up every single day and physically build the future of the country.
That corporate shareholder analogy perfectly captures the critique presented in the Vatican's framework.
Because if we look at the document Dignitas Infinita, the Vatican unequivocally states that human dignity is beyond every circumstance.
Yes, Pope Francis places an incredibly high value on the traditional family. He constantly emphasizes intergenerational solidarity and the profound importance of having children.
But the crucial point is that a Christian appreciation for the family cannot inherently demand the devaluation of childless individuals.
Exactly. You cannot lift up one demographic by suggesting another group's life is socially, politically, or democratically less fruitful.
Any language that measures a citizen's worth by their biological or economic output fails that baseline test of universal dignity.
It fails completely.
So we've spent a lot of time on where these two worldviews clash, but what about the areas where they seemingly completely align?
Like which ones?
Well, JD Vance is strictly conservative on issues like abortion. He famously argued that two wrongs don't make a right when discussing legislative exceptions for rape and incest, focusing intensely on protecting the life of the unborn.
Right.
And the Catholic Church is globally known for its absolute opposition to abortion. So isn't this an area where Vance and the Pope are reading from the exact same blueprint?
On the surface, yes, the alignment is absolute. Dignitas Infinita forcefully stresses the protection of life, from conception to natural death. The fundamental opposition to abortion is absolutely shared.
Okay.
However, the philosophical divergence lies in how comprehensive that ethic is required to be.
Comprehensive, like in that famous 2015 letter, Laudato Si.
Yes. Pope Francis detailed an entirely interconnected ethic of life there. He talks about the necessity of hearing both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor simultaneously.
So it's an all-or-nothing package.
Exactly. In that framework, you cannot passionately protect the unborn while simultaneously using language that devalues migrants, ignores the poor, or degrades the environment.
The ethic of life is a seamless garment.
Right. Selectively championing one form of vulnerable life because it aligns with a conservative political base, while rhetorically stigmatizing other vulnerable groups, fractures the entire moral foundation.
You can't pick and choose which vulnerable lives matter based on what's politically expedient for the current election cycle.
You really can't.
And our research shows this exact same philosophical nuance applies to LGBTQ plus issues, right?
It does.
Vance introduced the Protect Children's Innocence Act, aimed at banning gender-affirming medical care for minors. And in advocating for this, he utilized the term groomers to describe political opponents and advocates on this issue.
Right.
Now, the Vatican is certainly not progressive on modern gender theory.
They are not. Dignitas Infinita offers a sharp critique of certain gender theories and affirms traditional biological understandings of sex.
Right.
But there is a massive chasm between debating medical ethics or policy and deploying language that frames an entire marginalized demographic as predatory.
Right, because calling people groomers isn't a policy debate. It pathologizes a whole group. It throws a blanket of moral suspicion over them to score political points.
And we see the Pope's counter-approach in a recent document called Fiducia Supplicans.
That's the text that caused shockwaves, right?
Yeah, because it allows for pastoral blessings for couples in irregular situations, including same-sex couples. It absolutely does not change the Church's ancient doctrine on marriage.
But it fundamentally warns against a rigid approach that merely analyzes and classifies people based on their moral perfection.
Exactly. It's the stark difference between pastoral accompaniment meeting flawed human beings where they are with mercy and political stigmatization.
Where you classify and label people to consolidate your own power.
Yes. For Francis, mercy is the mandatory bridge between God and humanity.
So if public language is devoid of mercy, if its primary function is to classify, isolate, and condemn an other, it fails the ethical test, regardless of how rigidly conservative it is on specific hot-button issues.
Precise.
Well, let's look at the logical conclusion of this. If domestic language relies on categorizing who is useful to the country and who is a burden, what happens when that exact same logic is applied to people literally dying in a war zone?
That's the ultimate test of human dignity.
How does this transactional view of human worth scale up to global conflict? The research zooms out to examine Vance's commentary on the war in Ukraine, specifically his stated position, and I quote, "I don't really care what happens to Ukraine one way or another."
Right. And look, debating the logistics of foreign aid is one thing. Arguing over how many billions of taxpayer dollars should go overseas when there are massive infrastructure problems at home is the legitimate job of any elected official.
Sure.
The ethical crisis highlighted here isn't the policy position on funding, It is the tone.
But is Pope Francis just demanding naive pacifism here? Because a politician is uniquely responsible for their own citizens' safety and economy. He can't expect sovereign nations to just endlessly fund foreign wars to the detriment of their own people in the name of global solidarity, right?
Francis is not a naive pacifist. He does not deny a nation's legitimate right to self-defense against unprovoked aggression.
Right.
But he insists relentlessly that war is always a defeat of humanity. He refuses to talk about global conflict in abstract geopolitical terms like spheres of influence or budgetary constraints.
He forces the conversation back to the concrete victims.
Always. The elderly left behind in bombed-out buildings, the children losing limbs, the populations freezing and starving in the dark.
Francis often uses this striking phrase, the throwaway culture.
Yes.
We usually apply that to hyper-consumerism, fast fashion, mountains of single-use plastics, but he is actively applying that concept to human beings.
He is saying that in modern transactional politics, victims of war are treated like single-use plastics.
Yeah.
They become disposable numbers that you can simply toss aside when they become inconvenient to your domestic political agenda.
And saying, I don't care what happens to them, is the ultimate denial of that pre-existing, unassailable human dignity we established at the very beginning of this deep dive.
Absolutely. A truly just political framework cannot allow the pursuit of national interest to breed callous indifference to foreign suffering.
You can debate the financial realities, you can debate the military strategy.
But you cannot ethically say, I don't care. It severs the fundamental bond of universal fraternity.
So let's bring all of these threads together. What this scholarly breakdown reveals is that the collision between JD Vance's political rhetoric and Pope Francis's Catholic social ethics isn't about tax brackets or standard policy platforms.
No, it is about the fundamental posture of public language.
Does our political speech treat vulnerable people, whether they are Haitian migrants in an Ohio town, citizens without children, LGBTQ plus individuals, or civilians freezing in a Ukrainian winter, as possessors of an unbreakable, infinite dignity?
Or does it turn them into threats, burdens, and disposable tools for political mobilization?
Exactly.
Francis views politics as a lofty vocation, one of the highest forms of charity, but only when it actively prioritizes the vulnerable and refuses to build national unity by creating a terrifying other for the public to despise.
We started today by asking, what happens if language isn't just the wrapping paper on a policy, but the actual bricks we use to build our reality?
Right.
So we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. If political communication without truth and mercy just becomes manipulation, what happens to the psychological fabric of a society when its leaders completely lose the shared vocabulary of human dignity?
It's a scary thought.
When words are only ever used as weapons, as scalpels to divide populations and bludgeons to attack the marginalized, what happens to the everyday people who are caught in the crossfire of that rhetoric? We invite you to think about the real-world, flesh-and-blood impact of the political language you will inevitably hear tomorrow and the next day.
Pay attention not just to the policies being sold, but to the reality those words are quietly building all around you.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.